So welcome, everyone. We have a great opportunity here to talk to Luigi Chinetti Jr. and the North American racing team. Luigi was our Grand Marshal last year, and we had some requests for some questions. And one of them is, and really we're going to cover two subjects. And we'll get to the second one about the Ferrari movie at the end, because everybody wants to know what that is. But right now, I'd like you to talk a little bit about the founding of the North American racing team with your father, and just tell us some of that history that, that people maybe don't ask you about all the time, or that you feel is important to know. What are the significant things that brought it about, and what was its influence? So you start, and then however you want to go with this, and then I'll just ask you some questions from there.
Great. Well, the name started out very simply. We were going along the Merritt Parkway, my parents and I, and there was a North American Van Lines truck in front of us. And the two of them just said, well, that's interesting. So North American Racing Team was born on the back of a truck.
That's excellent. So what came first? Was the North American Racing Team first, or was setting up the dealer network in the United States first?
Well, the first thing of all was selling individual automobiles, because there never really was a dealer network.
Okay.
There were too many, there were just not enough cars. So the thing in the beginning was like 1947, Dad sold race cars, because we didn't have much in the way of street cars. And the street cars were all pretty much handmade. So you had individuals ordering automobiles. There was no such thing as a production car. There were too few cars, and most of them were race cars. Now, there were some that were street cars, but very few. The race cars were paid for by the street cars. And Dad's whole thing was racing. The whole thing from before the war,
right,
with Alfa Romeo, with Talbot, just before the war, because he entered 5 Talbots Le Mans just before the race, and 47, 40s. But the thing was, the Alfa Romeo was what made the whole thing work. And when we're doing this book, we never knew all of the history. And when he finished second in 1933, I believe, he set all the Alfas up that finished first, second, and third. His big deal was the engineering part. He prepared the cars.
Oh, I didn't realize that.
Period. And that started in the late 20s. I envy him for having lived in Paris in the 30s. Forget all the rest. Paris in the 30s with an Alfa Romeo.
Right.
He could drive around Paris with an Alfa Romeo and park. How many people could drive an Alfa and click when there was a depression going on?
Right.
I mean, and he had the velvet collars and then the mechanics outfit. He did it all. He could do the gearboxes, suspensions, and the driving. And like in 1949...
Because he was a machinist as well.
Oh, he worked for Nicola Romeo before it became Alfa Romeo in the 20s. He worked when he was like 18 years old, so that would have been 1919, something like that. He was a lathe operator, and he won all sorts of prizes for when he was that age, working for Nicola Romeo outside of Milan. And it's amazing. We have all the letters from Nicola Romeo. I mean, it was really this was no big deal. So they prepared a very few number of cars, and they ran everywhere. I mean, they were really a lot in France, mostly in France. Dad's history was far more in France and in Belgium. Italy, I'm not even sure I don't know that he raced in Italy. France and Belgium, England, I think he went there once, but he's famous for him. He said, I don't like to race in England because the food's terrible. Which is, in those days, wasn't so great. France and Belgium, you could really eat well. That was not a problem.
So when I've heard, and I really want to hear this from you, in 1949, Mr. Ferrari did not want to race in Le Mans. Is that true?
Oh, yeah, he was really upset about the whole idea because he said the cars wouldn't make it. But Dad said that his whole history was setting up racing engines. That was his whole deal.
That was a 166 mm, I think.
I beg your pardon?
That was a 166 mm?
Yeah.
Okay.
So he rebuilt the engine at Le Mans. The car came from Italy already set up. So he set it up very loosely. So the horsepower must have gone down significantly. And he had a little can for the oil because it was so loose. It wouldn't burn the oil, but it was very loose. But the horsepower, I don't know, 166 started out with what, 110 horsepower, 120 maybe, 110. So it must have dropped to 90, my guess.
Interesting. I was just at the Ferrari Challenge up in Watkins Glen, and one of those conversations over several drinks was about, in setting up a car, you actually want to have everything loose. The friction that builds up between too tight of a tolerance is not good. You want stuff a little bit worn out, so it's kind of all worked itself into position. It's interesting.
Well, it was loose. It was not run before, but it was loose from when he was building it.
Yeah.
And the thing is, the most interesting thing, which I copied later on, he sold the car so that if something happened, he didn't own it. But then it was Lord Selsdon. And Lord Selsdon actually was a good driver. But Dad's big deal was long distance, whether it was record setting, because he did a lot of records with the Alfa 2.3s at Montlhéry on the banked oval, 10, 12 hours. That was his deal. But the thing is, he sold the car to Lord Selsdon before the race, so that he slipped through the whole thing.
We're at Le Mans. If we, and we skipped around there, but yeah.
And then,
so the car that's racing at Le Mans that wins Le Mans that year actually was sold. It wasn't even a NART.
and he did
Which
that.
is a good story.
And he did that before the war.
Right.
With Raymond Sommer, he sold the car to him before the race as well. So years later, when I had an LM, as Bill knows, I sold the car to the customer before the race. And then you relax a little bit.
Yeah.
But Lord Selsdon was a good driver. But Dad knew the car. He had to drive it. So the poor fellow, he drove a half an hour out of 24. But Dad was always, because when people say, well, he must have taught you how to drive. No, not at all. One word, smooth. That's all he said. None of this or that. So smooth meant you had to keep it together. And indeed, we kept it together. But he won Spa 24 hours. He won Montlhéry. He won Le Mans. Everything long distance racing. That was his deal.
So as Ferrari became prominent as winning races with your father, how much of that was contributed by NART? In other words, how famous Ferrari became, or as it became famous, I should say, NART was a big part of that, was it not?
Well, NART was later on.
Okay.
I'm trying to think of the first race. I think it was with Bruce Kessler at Lime Rock in a Monza, maybe 55? Yeah, 55. And Bruce Kessler's mother owned a swimsuit company in California. So again, he owned the car, and it was the first sticker with NART. And the whole idea with NART was Dad wanted to promote American drivers.
Oh, okay.
And that was the whole idea. We sold cars to the Collier brothers in 47, maybe. There were on 2 or 3. There weren't many cars coming over. And in fact, Mr. Ferrari called Dad the dromedary because he would race. He'd get in the car, wouldn't get out. And so the two of them had a very healthy respect for each other. And button. And I actually don't envy Mr. Ferrari because before the war, he traveled around. After the war, he stayed in Modena because he had his biggest claim to fame was keeping about 100 Modenese to come to work every day. Because they are the stubbornest, orneriest, most talented people around. But they had to come. And most of them, they loved the racing, and they were really good. I mean, they weren't just hot, come by nights.
They're passionate about it.
Oh, but they were talented. Because when I went to Daytona with an LM in late 69 or something, it would jump out of gear. And the little factory mechanic was there, and I told him, it's jumping out of gears. I'm not doing anything this afternoon. I'll rebuild the gearbox. That's 3 hours later, 4 hours later, it's rebuilt. And he says, this is not going to last. You better take the first stent. And it went 23 and a half hours or 20, like that. And Greg Young, who bought the car, see, I took a page out of Dad's book. I'm like, I wasn't stupid. And he drove, and we finished. We started, 50th or something. We finished in the top 10. The poor little car was really tired because it had won Le Mans. It went all over the.
Yeah.
You could have put a Hertz sticker on the side. It would have been fitting.
So I think we need to get to the Ferrari piece of this, the Ferrari movie. What's your impression about the Ferrari movie?
Well, the car scenes of the mill media were evocative of the old days. They did not depict Mr. Ferrari the way I remember him because...
But stop on that point, because you've always referred to him as Mr. Ferrari, and that's a key thing that you said to me once, that it was never Enzo Ferrari.
No, I wouldn't. I've known him 70-some years. I would no more refer to him as Enzo than the man on the moon, because he called Dad Chinetti, and Chinetti called him Commendatore. There was this formality.
Yes.
I would never. The idea of calling Mr. Ferrari Enzo is just antithesis. It just wouldn't even occur to me.
Yeah. I'm sorry, but I didn't mean to interrupt. We were. Please continue. We were talking about. What were we talking about? Oh, the movie.
See, that's what happens when you get old.
See, we've been looking out to Bill Warner, who's our resident historian, this year's Grand Marshal, to give us direction and keep us on the right path. We're talking about the movie. So, your other thoughts on the movie?
Like I said, the scenes of the mill media, the original scenes, were very evocative of what it was like. The ones of Mr. Ferrari, very thin. He did not look like Mr. Ferrari. Mr. Ferrari was a rather strong, portly fellow. And Mr. and Mrs. Ferrari were not depicted the way they were. Mrs. Ferrari sort of made Mr. Ferrari. She was no will-o'-the-wisp. Now, in the movie, she was beautiful, which Mrs. Ferrari was in the years before. But she kept eyes on who was doing the work and what was going on.
Which led to the Palace Revolt.
Oh, yeah. But she knew she kept everything going and would report back. And Mr. Ferrari was no will-o'-the-wisp. I mean, he was sturdy. And that's what made the whole thing work. And Dad, on the Europe when he raced and over here, he made it work. In other words, that little group, they're all very strong people. And the engineers, whether it was Colombo, my God, they were all, they were very strong. And when they had in the movie, they had Mr. Ferrari correcting the intake manifolds. You didn't tell Mr. Colombo how to design an intake manifold. And Lampretti, same thing. These guys, they did it with a pencil, a T-square. I mean, you didn't tell them how. Oh, yeah. do this. You're sure. Good luck on that department. That wasn't going to fly.
So Mr. Ferrari really let his team, who were specialists at it, develop everything.
Well, the engines and the suspension, but he had the overlook. He got the mechanics, the engineers. He put the team together, and that's what made it work. And they were mainly interested in the single-seater cars in Europe, and Dad was interested in the enclosed bodywork, Spa in 24 hours in Belgium, because he won that as well. So they were parallel universe, if you want.
Yeah.
You had the American, but all sport kind of cars. Whereas Ferrari was always interested in the single-seaters. That was his bailiwick. But the sport cars paid, the ones with 2 seats paid for the ones with 1 seat. Basic.
Yeah. Well, hey, I got to thank you. We've got to wrap this up. There's another interview coming up, but really appreciate you coming up here and visiting us again to talk about this. This is always a pleasure, and we're going to do it again in a little bit.
Good.
All right. Thanks, everyone.